Hello guys, and welcome back to the audiobook Unmasking Our Leaders. I have no idea what episode this is, so if you want to find out, you can go back and look. We're on to chapter 6, Inside the National Front. In the early 1970s, I'd become a BBC TV reporter and made a film about the National Front, at the time the fastest growing political party in Britain. It was partly because General Idi Amin, the capacious strongman president of Uganda, was acting as recruiting sergeant for the front. Amin's sudden expulsion of Uganda's Asian population caused 30,000 refugees to come to Britain, and led to big National Front protest marches and a rapid increase in its membership. The Front gave us access to film in the hope of cleaning up its image. One of the greatest problems was that many of its members, including its leaders, had distinctly murky pasts. The Front's first chairman was a veteran far-righter called A.K. Chesterton, cousin of the renowned G.K. Chesterton. A.K. had been a founder member of Oswald Mosley's pre-war black shirt British Union of Fascists. He resigned as a National Front chairman, saying, "I had more than enough," after 4 years of stamping upon nonsense, such as plots to set fire to synagogues. Two former leaders of the British Nazi Party had taken over the leadership of the Front. One was party organiser Martin Webster, who had said about his previous party, "We're setting up a well-oiled Nazi machine in the country." And about the National Front, he claimed, "We aim to kick our way into the headlines." The new chairman of the Front was John Tyndall, who had been an avid Nazi and spent several spells in jail for assault and stirring up racial hatred. He had decided the National Front needed a fresh image as a party of respectable British nationalists. He himself had now taken on an ersatz version of the upper-class accent and gestures of a latter-day Oswald Mosley. Mosley himself was now staying in some style as a would-be grand old man in the Ritz Hotel in Piccadilly. When my producer Colin Martin and I went to see him there, he addressed us as if we were a public meeting. In an interview with me, he dismissed any linkage between himself and the National Front leaders, declaring in a booming voice, "If people are at one moment hopping around in Nazi uniform, that is dwarves masquerading in the uniform of dead giants. And if they then switch over to a John Bull poster in order to get votes on the immigration question, that is something completely ridiculous." As part of the report, we filmed at a packed National Front rally in Central Hall, Westminster. "Why did we fight the last war to see the best of our people replaced by what?" demanded one speaker. Some of the audience responded, "Whigs." Others were split between traitors and syphilis. When I interviewed Tyndall, I quoted back to him a line from his speech, in which he said, "Let us rejoice that fate has called us out from the dull grey masses to lead lives of great challenge and great purpose." I went on, "It does sound from that as if you see your own supporters as the chosen people." His unsmiling eyes narrowed, and he said with a touch of menace, "Aren't the Jews the chosen people?" At that moment the film ran out and we loaded up a new roll, and I put the question again. This time Tyndall answered soothingly, "It may seem like that to you, but I assure you that's not the way it is." We played both answers in the finished film. When he wrote about the programme in the NF magazine, Spearhead, Tyndall said, "I felt it useless to argue with the interviewer, a distinctly foreign-looking type, despite his English-sounding name of Cockerell. Dealing with these people was like dealing with slime. You think you have it in your hands, only to see it slip through your fingers and form again before your eyes." A.K. Chesterton had his own take on our film. He wrote in Candour, his monthly British newsletter, "Not content with befouling the air with this vile and tedious programme," Michael Cockerell said, "I wrote an adorning biography of Sir Oswald Mosley." It may be that I overestimated the qualities of that nevertheless great man, but it was not an adoring biography. Cockerell seems fond of the word, and it may be that in the world wherein he dwells men adore other men. In my world they do not. You would need a heart of stone not to laugh. When we filmed at front rallies and marches, we noted that 2 leading Tory MPs were always subjects of their attention. One was a hate figure, the other a hero. Heath is a traitor, the marches and their placards would proclaim, while many others would chant Enoch was right. Ted Heath and Enoch Powell had once been close colleagues, but had fallen out big time and become sworn enemies. Heath, who had been elected Conservative Prime Minister in 1970, had sacked Powell from his shadow cabinet 2 years earlier following his notorious anti-immigrant Rivers of Blood speech. He had also gained the hatred of the National Front for taking Britain into the European Union. I filmed and interviewed the 2 Tories over the years, and was later to make films about their lives. They were both mystical men, ideal subjects for political psychotherapists, and for our camera. Chapter 7. A Very Singular Man. Of all the leading politicians I had made films about over the years, the trickiest to deal with was Ted Heath. He was a man of many moods. Sometimes when you made the pilgrimage to film him at his breathtakingly beautiful house that resembled a mini chateau in the grounds of Salisbury Cathedral, he would be jovial and jubilant. At other times he would be in a total grump and a monosyllable in his answers. His customary mode of greeting was to make you feel not at home, to try to destabilize you before you had even started. As we sat down for one interview, he said, "Have you got your usual list of boring questions?" "Yes, exactly the same," I replied. "Oh well, we'd better get it over with." I thought the interview went reasonably well, and when it was finished I asked if he thought the questions had been as boring as usual. "Oh yes," he replied, "but infinitely more irrelevant." I told his private secretary about this. "That's good. If he's rude to you, it means he likes you." On another occasion he said, "I was thinking about you as I was coming here, and I want to ask, do you have any training at all for this?" I replied jokingly, "No, none at all. I don't do any reading about you, either books or newspapers. I don't talk to people who know you, nor do I listen to an old radio or TV interviews you have done." He replied, "Oh, that would account for it." When my producer, Matthew Barrett, and I were making a film about his life, Heath told me that he decided he was going to be Prime Minister when he was at the local grammar school in the Kent seaside town of Broadstairs. "But I didn't tell the other boys, as they might have been jealous," he said. Taking Heath back to Oxford to film him in Balliol, he had won an organ scholarship to the college and put him into one of his genial moods. In the grand dining hall we talked as we inspected the imposing portraits of old Balliol men who had become Prime Ministers: Asquith, Macmillan, and Heath himself. Boris Johnson had yet to come. I asked Heath if he thought that Balliol imparted some quality that helped in becoming Prime Minister. "Oh yes, complete mental control, intellectual control," said Heath. "You mean what Asquith called the tranquil consciousness of effortless superiority?" I said. "Yes, absolutely," he replied. "It's the first thing they teach you from the moment you get here." And he felt that for the rest of his life. Yes, that's what caused so much trouble. And he gave his shoulder-heaving laugh. Heath was an exact contemporary at his college of the two best prime ministers we never had, Denis Healey and Roy Jenkins, both former Labour chancellors. Healey told me that at Balliol, Teddy Heath, as he was known then, was shocked to learn that a fellow student planned to spend the weekend with his girlfriend at a hotel outside Oxford. Heath asked Healey, "You don't think they're going to sleep together, do you?" The more worldly Healey replied, "I haven't asked, but I imagine so, yes." "Good heavens," responded Heath, "I can't imagine anyone in the Conservative Association doing that." When I told Heath what Healey had said, he replied, deadpan, "And were they both Conservatives?" We took Heath back to Nuremberg, where he had gone as an undergraduate in 1937 to assess himself. The menace of Nazism. Heath told me that as he sat next to the gangway, Hitler brushed his shoulder as he strode up to address the rally. What he witnessed there, and later as an artillery officer during the Second World War, inspired in him the idea that would dominate his whole political life. I saw in German cities practically everything was destroyed, and as I was convinced then, what my generation had to do was to create a unity in Europe which would mean that this would never happen again. While Heath would talk fluently about the political influences on him, he was notoriously guarded about his private life. The one exception came when we arranged to film him in Broadstairs, where he was born and grew up. I met him when he stepped out of his car, and instead of his usual insult for a greeting, he beamed at me and said, "Smell that air. Wonderful, isn't it? The best in the world." He was relaxed and amicable over our lunch in the best hotel. He ate smoked salmon, fresh asparagus with hollandaise sauce, but he refused a drink. Never before a big interview, he said. When we began recording for the first time, he opened by a fraction the doors onto his feelings. He had never before talked publicly about his girlfriend from Broadstairs. She was Kay Raven, the daughter of the local doctor, who went out with Heath before the war, and for 6 years waited patiently for his return from the front. Heath did take up with her again after the war, and his friends expected the couple to marry, but he never got round to proposing. "Why was that?" I asked. "She decided she would marry someone else." "But I don't discuss these things," said Heath. "Did you get over it?" "Yes." "It was said you kept her photograph by your bed." "Yes." "Did you?" "Yes." And Heath looked away as if he was close to tears. He also talked so movingly about the death of his beloved mother, and I felt we had crossed a barrier, and when we next met he would be more forthcoming. The opposite happened. It was as if he had decided to give me just a little single glimpse, but never again. Discussing Heath later with his great friend and the former Cabinet Secretary Robert Armstrong, I said how difficult I had found it to get him to open up about his personal life. Lord Armstrong replied, "You got more out of him than I have managed in 50 years of friendship." Heath became a Conservative MP in the 1950 general election, along with Enoch Powell, and they joined the newly formed One Nation group of Tory modernisers. Appointed a junior whip, Heath developed a reputation as a skilled party manager, and would spend most of the next decade operating behind the scenes. I asked if he enjoyed the business of organisation. "Oh, immensely, yes, because I loathe incompetence and inefficiency and bungling and waste and all those things." Within 4 years, the organisation man was made chief whip. He was seen as a formidably efficient, skilled at shepherding Tory MPs through the right division lobby via a mixture of persuasion, promise and threat. He faced his biggest challenge to party unity with the 1956 Suez crisis. He mentored Prime Minister Anthony Eden, sent British troops to seize back the Suez Canal from the Egyptian military strongman, Colonel Nasser, who had nationalised it. There was speculation that Eden had secretly collaborated with the French and the Israelis to stage the invasion. He told me a remarkable story about what happened to the secret cabinet papers about the invasion. He said that Eden had a meeting with the government's top civil servant, the cabinet secretary, Sir Norman Brooke. Heath continued, Norman Brooke came out of the meeting and said, the Prime Minister has told me to burn the lot. Of the secret papers on Suez? Yes. And I asked, is that what Cabinet Secretary went off and did? Yes. And what did you feel about that? Well, the Cabinet Secretary was carrying out the PM's orders about Cabinet documents. He was only obeying orders, I said. Yes, said Heath. But I persisted. What did he feel about a Cabinet Secretary going off and destroying secret documents, which, if they had been made public, would prove the Prime Minister had lied to the House? The Cabinet Secretary was doing his job. But what sort of view is this of the morality of a Prime Minister who lies to the House and then tells the Cabinet Secretary to destroy the documents? What's your view about that? Well, my view is that I haven't destroyed any Cabinet documents. Even 40 years after Suez, Heath's sense of loyalty meant that he could not bring himself to utter a word of condemnation of the Prime Minister he still saw as his patron. Anthony Eden had died 20 years before our interview. Although Eden's wife was still alive, it may be that Heath did not want to offend her. The Tory Chief Whip is the keeper of the party secrets, and makes it his business to know about the sexual and financial indiscretions of his MPs. In February 1958, a scandal blew up involving Colonel Ian Harvey MP, one of Heath's Oxford contemporaries, and a junior minister. Homosexuality was still a criminal offence, and Harvey was found having sex in the bushes with a guardsman in St James's Park. Winston Churchill, who was then still an MP, laughed it off. On the coldest night of the year, makes you proud to be British. Harvey stood down from Parliament and later wrote a book, To Fall Like Lucifer. One of the researchers whom Heath employed to help write his autobiography noticed Harvey's book on Heath's bookshelf. A researcher opened it and found it had a handwritten dedication from Colonel Harvey to Ted, who knows what it's like. But when the researcher went to look at the book the next day, it was gone, and it was never seen again. The researcher didn't have the confidence to ask Heath about the inscription. In 1965, after the Tories had had 3 old Estonian Prime Ministers in a row, Heath stood for the party leadership against the former Chancellor, Reggie Maulding, and Enoch Powell, a former Health Secretary. It was the first time Tory MPs could vote for their leader. Previously, the leader would emerge via what one Tory grandee described as the customary processes of consultation conducted by the magic circle of old Estonians. Heath won and Powell came third, but as he put it, I left out my calling card. Heath had been elected because Tory MPs thought a grammar school boy of humble origins would be a match for the Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who was running rings around them. But when Wilson called the snap election, Heath was buried by a Labour landslide. Heath was soon under pressure for lack of leadership. In contrast to Wilson, whom he scorned as a confidence trickster, Heath was an image-maker's nightmare. He despised the whole process, disliked television, and generally felt that there was more important things in life than being interviewed on camera. Things went from bad to worse. Heath agreed to appear on a panorama programme about the Tories' troubles. The programme's presenter, Robin Day, began his interview with, "Mr. Heath, how long does your own popularity have to sink among your own supporters before you consider yourself a liability to the party you lead?" Heath answered, "Well, popularity isn't everything." Robin had been one of the great "have you stopped beating your wife" questions, although famously, of course, Ted Heath didn't have a wife, and the polls suggested that Heath's bachelor status told against him. A Tory backbencher, Sir Tufton Beamish, had helped organise Heath's leadership campaign, and now came up with a cunning plan. He would try to find Heath a wife. He knew that Heath had shared a love of music with the great concert pianist Maura Limpany, and the two were close friends. Sir Tufton arranged to meet Dame Maura. We flew to Monte Carlo to talk to the Grand Dame. She told me Tufton came to see me and said Maura, Ted must get married. Will you marry him? I replied, if Ted asked me to marry him, I would have considered it a great honour. And would you have said yes? Ah, well, if I hadn't been in love with someone else. We showed the clip to Heath, whose face lit up when he saw Maura on the screen. I liked her, and apparently she liked me. We had a common interest in music, good food and wine. I asked Heath if he had known about Beamish's demarche. No, Tufton never discussed it with me. So does that come as a surprise to you? Nothing surprises me these days, said Heath. And did you think of asking Maura Limpany to marry you? I never discussed these matters at all. Ted is a little bit defensive on women, of course, for obvious reasons, said his lifelong friend, Brigadier Ken Hunt, who had been at school with him. First of all, people say he's queer, or that he's sweet on Maura Limpany, that sort of thing. And actually, he's wedded to his politics, and that's it. There's no place for anybody else, and Dame Maura said the most intimate thing Ted has ever done over the years was to put his arm round my shoulder. To the astonishment of pundits and politicians alike, the Tories won the 1970 general election, and as Prime Minister, Heath's prickly personality came to count against him with the public. A string of publicity advisers tried to change my image, he told me, but they soon found there was nothing they could do about it, and gave up in despair. Heath cut a lonely figure in number 10. One of his closest acolytes, Cabinet Minister Pete Walker, told the journalist Max Hastings that he never left a meeting in number 10 without a sense of sympathy, even pity, for Heath. If I make a speech, said Walker, my wife Tessa's always there to mutter, wonderful speech, darling, such a pity your fly buttons were undone. Ted has absolutely no one in his life to say those things. I asked Heath if he felt he had missed out anything by never having married. No, a lot of people say I've gained, because instead of having to spend time with one's family, or not spend time, and being divorced, I've just been free to use my time in the world of politics. Heath had moved his own grand piano into number 10. His political secretary, Douglas Hurd, said that Heath had the disadvantage of not having a wife to discuss matters with at the end of the day, and going upstairs and playing the piano is not really quite an adequate compensation for that. He saw things differently. He told me music is a complete contrast to one's daily work, and what it does is to absorb the mental and emotional feelings, and you can then produce them yourself in whatever way you want, whether it's on the piano or any other instrument. I asked Heath, do you think that music has been a substitute in your life for love? No, not at all. You can have love in a variety of ways, and music is one of them. His most controversial achievement was to take Britain into the European community. Previous attempts at entry had been blocked by the French. Heath decided to woo them in their native tongue. His pronounced English accent was the worst heard from a British Prime Minister since Churchill, who made no attempt at all to sound French. We played Heath a clip of his speech, and I asked what he thought of his accent. He replied, well, I think it's very good, but nobody here in Britain thinks so. The French, on the other hand, are always very kind and say, c'est magnifique, and over here they say what an awful noise he was making. But he struck up a personal relationship with President Pompidou, who lifted his predecessor General de Gaulle's veto on British entry. The lifelong Europhile Ted Heath said the day he signed the accession treaty was the proudest of his life, and that night he went to his piano and played part of Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier to celebrate. A small group of Tory anti-European MPs led by Enoch Powell were not so happy. Heath was facing a rough time on the home front. He ran into a range of economic and trade union problems and was forced into a series of policy U-turns. We filmed as I quoted to Heath a passage from Douglas Hurd's diary. The government is wandering round the battlefield, looking for someone to surrender to, and is being massacred all the time. Heath responded, that was silly, that very silly. I mean, the very language of it was silly. How can a responsible person, especially someone who's a political secretary to the Prime Minister, produced stuff like that in his diary. One member of Heath's cabinet totally agreed with Hurd, Margaret Thatcher. She said nothing at the time, but she later wrote in her memoirs about Heath's numerous policy U-turns. Although we had totally changed course, we had kept the same helmsman. And even as we headed for rock-strewn waters, he remained supremely confident of his navigational skills. I put the quote to Heath, and he said, well, somebody must have written that for her. She couldn't do it herself. As inflation soared and oil prices quadrupled, the miners went on strike. Britain was subjected to various epidemics to save electricity, such as the 3-day working week, and there were ministerial exhortations to clean your teeth in the dark. Although as Prime Minister Heath normally preferred to hold grandiose press conferences in the aloof style of President de Gaulle when he came under siege in late 1973, he turned to television. He sought to use straight-to-camera broadcasts to try and rally the public behind the government, but he had made no previous effort to establish a rapport with the viewers. One of his great friends, former BBC Director General Ian Tretholian, said to me, when it mattered most to Ted, he failed to get his private charm across on television. When I put that to Heath, he looked at me with his baleful, light blue eyes and said, I don't think a miners' strike is the time to come on television and ooze charm, do you? Heath called a snap general election asking the question, who rules Britain? It invited and received the response, not you, matey. Harold Wilson returned to number 10 as leader of a minority government. Ted Heath was a man capable of denying point-blank things that were a matter of public record. He would claim that he never committed a single policy U-turn as Prime Minister, even though his last years in office bristled with them. Nor was he prepared to admit that he had made mistakes in his career. When I put this to him, he said there seems to be an obsession with interviewers on mistakes. I don't know what to do about it. I might introduce a school course or something, how to say good things about people. One of the people Heath himself could never say a good word about was his bête noire, Enoch Powell. After Heath had sacked Powell from the Shadow Cabinet in 1968, after his notorious Rivers of Blood speech, the two men were once friends, never spoke again. Yet they had a number of traits in common, not least in their private lives. And that's the end of this episode, guys. You want to see more, please like it, comment and subscribe. See you next time. Bye.